Welcome to the 5th lecture for English 421Y. In this video, I will briefly describe the visual instructions or procedures assignment, discuss strategies for producing a visually dominant document, and then provide a few examples. For the second part of Unit 2, you will create a separate document that presents similar information, but for a different audience and situation, and using primarily visuals. The setting can be the same as in Unit 1, for example, a current internship or job, but I want you to imagine a scenario, audience, and purpose that would be better suited to visual instructions. Again, it's okay if they are similar, but you will need to strategically match your genre and rhetorical situation in a way that makes sense. You will also need to select a predominantly visual genre, whether print or digital, and then determine the tools and media that will work best for your needs. You will decide how to make your visuals, and you can do so using technical tools, or you can do so using pens and colored pencils. Whatever works best for you. While the information on both the textual and visual documents can be similar, you are allowed to change your angle to take into account the different possibilities of textual and visual media. That is, you might visualize one complex step within the larger process that you described in your textual instructions. Not only is that okay, it's probably unavoidable. Whenever I teach this assignment, I always have somebody who does a visual that is one slice of the larger process, because describing that process takes a lot more space visually than it does textually. Also, whenever I teach this project, someone always points out that an effective document should probably have a balance between visuals and text. I completely agree, but this assignment is meant to challenge your critical thinking and problem solving by forcing you to use two extremes rather than a more logical middle ground. Ideally, you should see that there are negatives to both an all-visual and an all-textual document, and that those negatives can be mitigated with a more balanced approach. That approach is what we will be using in Unit 3. But to get there first, I want you to understand what a mostly textual and a mostly visual document looks like and how you create that. A key thing to remember is that you can use text in your visual instructions. You can have captions. You can have an introductory blurb. You can have a call-out box, just as you can include images in your text instructions. The difference is that with the visual instructions, the meaning should be communicated primarily by visuals rather than by text, whereas with the text instructions, it's the exact opposite. Let me explain what I mean by the meaning should be communicated by visuals or by text by returning to Graves and Graves chapter 8, where they describe how visuals can be used to create meaning within instructions and procedures. Depending on the purpose, they argue, visuals can be used to clarify the text, support it, or supplement it. They identify 4 methods for relating text and visuals in order to create meaning within a document. The first is stage setting, or the use of visuals to communicate information that is different than the text on the same page, but is often used to forecast the content ahead of the text. They give the example here of including a toolbar for a set of instructions about using Adobe Dreamweaver. You may not talk about all of the different pieces of this toolbar, but it forecasts that in later steps you will talk about the others that you don't talk about in the first. The next method is redundancy. That is, using visuals and text that convey exactly the same information in order to repeat the key ideas, especially for processes or concepts that are complex and challenging. A good example of this is in a science textbook that may describe in text a particular process or system, and then it will have a nice graphic or visual that describes that same exact system or process, but using visuals. A third method is complementary. Text and visuals each provide slightly different information, and both are required to ensure full understanding. The two modes together then communicate the complete idea better than either one would alone. They have a good example of this on page 238, where they have instructions for using word art in Microsoft Word. On the left, you see the numbered instructions, and on the right, you see the complementary visuals. Notice in the text instructions, they have references to the visuals. And notice that in the visual instructions, they have text that clarifies the visuals alone. This, again, is a complementary use of both. This set of instructions would not be nearly as strong without both visual and textual instructions. This is why you can use text in the visual instructions and visual in the textual instructions. Often you need that extra layer of meaning in order to convey the information. Finally, there is the supplementary method, where one of the modes is dominant and conveys the main information, while the other mode mostly confirms or elaborates the point. This method is the most common way to integrate text and graphics, often with the text being the dominant message and the visual serving as an example. This, again, is the most common form that we'll see in most textbooks, in most instructions. They're mostly visual with a little bit of images. In an ideal world, all text would have complementary text and visuals. That is, you can't understand the information without having both in equal measure. Because we don't live in an ideal world, most documents have a supplementary use of visuals. That is why for the visual instructions assignment, I am deliberately asking you to make visuals using the dominant mode of conveying meaning as images. A role that Graves and Graves note usually goes to text. We will return to the complementary, redundant, and stage setting methods when we work on page design during Unit 3, but for now, we're doing one set of instructions where text is the dominant mode, and one set of instructions where visuals are the dominant mode. To give you an idea of what a set of instructions that use visuals as the dominant mode looks like, I want to turn to perhaps one of the most famous examples of predominantly visual instructions. And that's the building instructions that come with Legos. I'm a nerd, so I've selected one related to Star Wars. Legos instruction sets are entirely visual, something that you don't necessarily think about when you're a kid and you're putting them together. But there are no words within the actual body of this 238-page manual. So how do they do it? There are a couple of things that allow them to successfully use complex instructions that have no text. The first is goals are clearly identified. The current objective is communicated through occasional orange boxes. You know by looking at this that you're making the superstructure of this spaceship rather than the entire structure. You're making the internal pieces of it. This shows that the final product next to the section that the user is currently working on. This juxtaposition between them identifies your current goal, and then you can see that everything after this is building towards that current goal. Next, the steps are easily numbered. Each step in the process is carefully identified with large white numbers, while sub-steps within a larger process, such as this one here, are given sub-numbers, or this one here in the yellow call-out box. Third, change indicates progress. You know that you're moving on to the next step because the image shows additional elements. So you can compare what yours looks like to what is indicated in the instructions. Each step lets you know what you have and what you should have. This is a key grammar of Lego instructions that at first is kind of odd. You expect some sort of explanation, and when you don't get it, you just assume before I go to the next step, I need to make sure mine looks exactly like theirs. Again, it's strange at first, but it quickly becomes natural. Next, they use boxes to call out information. We've already seen orange and yellow boxes, but the blue boxes are the most common in this set of visual instructions. The blue boxes that appear frequently in the top left indicate new pieces being introduced to the existing structure that you have on the step that you're on. These are pieces that have different sizes, shapes, colors, and quantities, and these are all called out carefully in these boxes. There's also yellow boxes, going back a couple steps, that show the creation of an individual piece that is then added to the larger piece that you're building. These boxes clearly indicate new information and call out steps that might be different than what the user has been expecting. We also have arrows and lines used to show directional information through clever uses of arrows. So we have, this case, a yellow line going from the box to indicate where the piece is shown. We have others, such as, let me find one. This one, you have the steps in the yellow box, and then you have the line that goes across the page and on to the next page, indicating where the piece that you built on the previous page should now go. This use of arrows allows directional information like place the piece that you just created on the middle to easily be shown. Sometimes you also see horizontal lines that are used to indicate when you have two pieces that are totally separate. This is a very separate step from this, so they have the horizontal line to indicate that separation. Finally, and perhaps most importantly to Legos, information is consistently repeated through the use of specific elements. Even though what the user is building changes on every page, the design element stays consistent throughout. Impressively, even after only a few pages, you have seen all the major design features of this set of instructions that you need in order to make the entire 200 plus pages of this manual without any explanatory text. That's incredible. And what's even more incredible, I think, is that every time you build a different Lego set, they use the same design features. They might include things a little bit differently based on what you're building, but the same visual language is used. It's consistent, it's simple, and it's compact. Even in 228 pages, this is a pretty straightforward manual. The trade-off is that because each step is broken down, literally piece by piece, the manuals are very long. However, if you've ever built a Lego set with a child, you know that this can create problems, but usually you can take breaks or separate things. However, the benefit of this approach is that you can print the same manual anywhere in the world without worrying about translating the instructions. There is no text, so what works in North America will work in Europe and will work in Asia. You can also reuse the same design for almost every Lego set, since the only thing that changes is the specific structure that you're building. Okay, perhaps the most important thing to remember when creating visuals is that, like the resume, they must be user-centered documents. In this chapter, I was assigned by Edward Tufte. He argues that visuals must tell a rich, coherent story. Too often, we think of visuals as self-evident, or worse, we imagine them only from our perspective as the writer, and then in relation to what we hope to accomplish. Imagining instead that our visuals are telling a story or a narrative, we can think about graphics in terms of not just the information being communicated, but the reaction we hope to get from an audience. He gives a great example of this map, which is one of the most famous visualizations. It shows the progression of Napoleon's army in the 1800s from Poland to Moscow and back. This large line shows how his force dwindled as it got to Moscow, and then the black line shows the retreat. And then here you see this huge force of some 400,000 plus troops compared to the tiny returning force of 10,000. Tuft argues that this creates a compelling narrative that makes the audience want to understand it. It makes the audience want to read it. It understands that whoever's reading this needs to know not just geographical information, which is shown by city names and rivers and things like that, but also chronological information, which is shown here by the months in which Napoleon's army returned, but also the size of the army and their relative direction. We get that it's a conquering force here and it is a retreating force here through different uses of color and shading. Altogether, this comes to create a very compelling and rich document. Imagining instead that our visuals are telling a story or narrative, we can think about graphics in terms not just the information being communicated, but the reaction we hope to get from an audience. That reaction might simply be to accept the information provided, but it might also be to prompt an action, to make an argument, as this visualization does, to grab people's attention, which I'd also argue this visual does, or even to entertain. As Tuft writes, graphical excellence is that which gives to the viewer the greatest number of ideas in the shortest time with the least ink in the smallest space. Successful visuals are those that present a compelling story and generate a strong reaction quickly and effectively. As an example of this, I want to end this lecture with a brief word about genre and a recent example. As I've said, you have free rein to decide how best to communicate your instructions or procedures to your audience. You can use digital tools, you can use colored pencils, whatever. But I strongly recommend selecting a genre that is current and relevant, that is familiar to the audience, that is easy to develop, and that plays to your strengths as the creator. To demonstrate the importance of these 4 best practices, I want to use a recent genre that you have likely seen on Facebook, and that's BuzzFeed's tasty recipe videos. Here's an example. So there's these 4 best practices. First, the tasty videos are a relevant take on an established genre that uses the current trend of sharing short viral videos on social media in order to change how people get recipes. This is a 30-second video that explains an entire recipe that might be a page or maybe a 5-minute video. It does so quickly in a way that can easily be shared on smartphones and designed specifically to be accessed by different apps. You can share this on Facebook, you can share this on Twitter, you can share this on Instagram, you can share this in an email. Second, as audiences become familiar with this genre of a less than minute-long hyper-visual POV recipe video that is point of view, we're starting to see it replace more traditional recipe videos. The other day I was on Facebook and lo and behold, suddenly the Food Network is doing the same kind of video. Third, these videos are relatively easy to develop as they have very, very little text, no dialogue or narration, and they only show an actor's hands, rather than having to hire a personality or an actor to do the entire video. While they definitely require considerable editing, they're likely more cheaper than a traditional cooking show. And then finally, BuzzFeed plays to their strengths by reconceiving the recipe as a short viral video that is almost exclusively communicated on social media. This kind of video is what BuzzFeed is known for, and they simply replicate for recipes what has worked for videos about cute kittens and puppies. So you can choose a more conventional genre like a poster or infographic, or you can select something like a BuzzFeed video that is more recent and popular. Whichever you choose, make sure it emerges from your scenario, fits your audience and purpose, and would be appropriate in your setting. In the examples that I've given you for Unit 2, one of those examples is a video. I included this to show you a good example of video instructions for this project. Note that these videos are close to 12 minutes long. That's because he was reading his text instructions and then performing the actions as he was doing it. He ended up revising things a little bit in the final draft, but this draft shows that if you do something like a video, it's going to be a little bit different in terms of the expectations than if you do a poster. That's why the proposal memo that you're going to write before you do both the text and visual instructions, that will help me negotiate with you what makes most sense for your video. That's it today. Good luck developing your visual instructions.